Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Carson. I am a Skadden Fellow here at Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I'm also Yavapai and Chiricahua Apache. My family now lives in New Mexico. And I'm very happy to be here with you all today and talk about this very important topic, which is serving LGBTQ2S plus participants in tribal healing and wellness courts. And we'll talk a little bit about that acronym and what terminology we use throughout this presentation a little bit later, but I want to be able to give the chance for Marlon to be able to introduce theirself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marlon Footracer. I am a program support specialist here at TLPI, and I am so happy to be joining Grace, Angie, Chelsea, and the rest of the TLPI team on this webinar. I am a program support specialist, and my area of focus are tools that we use at TLPI, so webinars, publications, website, and all those really good resources. I'm going to pause in for those accessing the live recording now and those in the post recording. I'm going to introduce myself in Navajo. Yeah, it's Aabina, Sha'e Marlin Foot Racer Yanishya, Tuhaglini Nishla, Punagani Bashishin, Kintachi A Dishnella, Tutichini A Dishache. And that's all to say that my name is Marlon Foot Racer. I am Water Flows Together, born for one who walks around you clan. And I'm so excited to be here. And I'll turn the time over to Grace to get us started.
Great, thank you for that. So this presentation really is going over one of TLPI's new publications. We have 4 different ones, but this one is our resource guide, which I was the primary author on for this topic. But Marlon was such a great help in helping that publication come together in terms of editing. And Marlon also has incredible insight on this topic as well. And so I had to bring them in to help me present on this topic. And so that's a little background about how we came to presenting this webinar. You can do next slide, Chelsea.
Great. And we wanted to begin to open the space, both the live version and the recorded space afterwards. A personal disclaimer and a little bit about positionality. We co-wrote this disclaimer together, and it is basically that even though we identify as tribal people, we do not speak on behalf of all tribes, nor do we speak on behalf of the tribes that we represent. It is our individual experience. We don't represent Native people or all LGBTQ2S plus folks, spelled with an X, only from our own personal experience, lived experiences. And to that, we want to create intentional creation of the space to be discrimination, heavy language, violent free. And we'd like you to bring your full self to the presentation without fear of being imperfect. We also acknowledge that we are all imperfect. And for anyone who is my Navajo elder, I beg for forgiveness for anything that I might say. We also want to prioritize the self and community care. So if you feel that you need to take space at any point during the webinar, you may do so. So with that, we'll jumpstart into the presentation.
Thank you, Marlon. I also wanted to point out that we do have a Q&A and we'll answer questions at the end. But if there's any relevant questions that Marlon picks out, he'll kind of help me get there. We can answer them also live, but just wanted to note that as well. So to go over some objectives for this webinar, first, as Marlon stated, we want to make room for safe learning and an understanding that to be human is to be fallible. And so what me say in this webinar may not be perfect, what you say in a Q&A may not be perfect, how we treat our clients may not be perfect, but that is all a part of the learning process, which is how Indigenous people have learned and created knowledge for centuries. So we just want to make sure that we have that as our objective here. We want to highlight practicing tribal sovereignty through caretaking and making space for LGBT plus relatives. So we just really want to highlight the point that to care for our community members, including those who have through colonization become ostracized, that is a way that we practice tribal sovereignty. Caring for each other and protecting one another is how we practice our tribal sovereignty, and we really want to highlight that throughout our webinar. We want to also introduce the needs and issues of LGBT plus participants, including those that are particular to the Native community. And so we'll go over that a little bit through this webinar, kind of touch on some issues. Again, every person is different, so every person is going to have needs that are unique and tailored to them. But we just want to kind of give an introduction to that from participants you might be seeing in your courts and in your programs. We also want to introduce resources for caretaking LGBT plus participants in healing to wellness courts. And that is what this resource guide publication, which goes to my next point, we want to introduce TLPI's new publication on this topic. In that resource guide, which we will link in the chat, you'll be able to find all of the resources that we've gathered. Of course, there's going to be some other resources. We also have some forthcoming resources noted too. And this is really an area in which we're just in the healing to wellness court community and throughout and we'll get to this too, but throughout the treatment court community, we're just beginning to talk about this topic and how important it is and being able to highlight the issues that are particular to this community. And that's what we hope to do, is really open up this space for this conversation and get that ball rolling for healing to wellness court programs through this webinar. Next slide.
So, as Gracie mentioned at the top of the webinar recording, there were a whole bunch of letters in the introductory slide. You might see variations of this. People have affectionately called it things like alphabet soup, the rainbow letter soup. And we want to take a pause and hold space for and do a brief overall explanation of what those terms might be. Some of them might be new to you, for example, the plus sign. And we also ask for forgiveness from the LGBTQ2S plus community that if we linguistically omit a letter, that we don't do it intentional, and please be kind to us as we also learn. So with that, let's go ahead and position this discussion as introductions are stories. Hi, my name is Marlon Footracer. I, subject, M, name, identity. That's what we do every day at work. When we send an email, we introduce ourselves to new team members, when we collaborate, we go out into the communities, clients that you all serve, whatever industry it may be, tribal healing to wellness courts, law enforcement, social services, mental health services. We all interact at a brief moment where we begin to tell our story. And with that, I would like to open up the space before we dive into specific terminology to quote our former poet laureate, Joy Harjo, in her introduction to her anthology of poetry, "When the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through." She has this sentence: "Words are living beings." And we want to activate that site of knowledge, that Indigenous epistemology, to begin our discussion and journey into terminology. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So, as we said, LGBTQ2S plus. If we go ahead and access the publication that we mentioned that this webinar is about, which the link is dropped in the chat, there is a section at the end that is a glossary in the appendices. That, for those following live, that begins on page 15. And if we begin under the L's, we find that there's a big variation of different identities represented by each of the letter. They range anywhere from LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBT2S plus, and any other form of variation of ordering. But generally, when you encounter this, again, with our modality of storytelling, it is an umbrella term referring to people who identify as lesbian, L, gay, G, bisexual, B, and or transgender, T. Sometimes the acronym is written as LGBT with the Q referring to as those individuals who identify as queer or questioning. And the acronym can also include a whole range of additional letters. There's some instances where industries insert an I in there for intersex, in reference to other identities that do not conform to dominant societal norms around sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. A lot of this terminology we're pulling from Gleason.org, and that also stands, another acronym, that stands for the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, which was founded by a group of teachers in my exploration and preparation for this webinar. I'll go ahead and drop that Gleason link there in the chat. So here we are. We arrive at our definitions. LGBTQ2S plus. For the folks that are joining us in the recording, just a show of hands or participation. Would you say that you're familiar with this terminology? You can elect to say yes or no, but we see a raised hand. Oh, good. We do have some folks here who are informed. Another folk joining us, so we really appreciate that. And again, we do person first. We arrive where you are. Let's go ahead and transition into sexual orientation. So if we go back to the glossary of the resource that we're referencing, um, I want to do a fair quoting of that resource during this recording. So that is the inner feelings of a person who is attracted to emotionally and or physically in relation to someone of their own gender identity. Again, under sexual orientation, we have another range of identities. Some folks might, with an X, may identify as asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, queer, straight, and many more. Interesting side note that the what's wonderful about language is that it develops and morphs and things develop over time. And we are here to be open to listen and affirm those spaces. Next, we have gender versus sex. Gender relying on there's I want to couch this. It's a very complex issue. Even for myself, I also struggle with terminology. But if we go back to a working definition in our publication that Grace had authored, gender, we share that gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, boys, women, men, and gender diverse people. What we should know about that individual choice of identity, it influences how people perceive themselves and each other and how they act and interact and the distribution of power and resources in society. For folks who might go back to social studies or psychology 101 courses, the big terminology that we might be familiar with is interpolation. Systems interpolate us, whether they're school, whether they're justice systems at the workplace, personal one-on-one relationships, dyads, friendships. And so it's very important that here, as we talk about this metaphor of storytelling, that we become aware, number one, of ourselves, our positionality, our intersectionality understanding, and then how others around us identify. To that, let's go into something that is based in optics, gender identity. Very, very important here, a disclaimer that gender identity is not confined to a binary system, i.e. Girl, boy, man, woman, and that it is not static. People in various industries identify that there is a spectrum of gender identity and gender expression. Um, and it exists on a continuum and it can change over time. Let's reflect back, introduce our Indigenous perspective and our Indigenous epistemologies. If you go from your Indigenous community, think about and ruminate whether there are words, phrases, even non-spoken modalities of communication that these really big concepts are being transported in. And we also acknowledge that there's a considerable diversity in how individuals and groups understand, experience, and express gender through the roles they take on and the expectations placed on them, relations with others, and the complex ways that gender is institutionalized in society. Um, we want to make sure, again, as a reminder, if you have any questions and if anyone has any ideas that pop up, again, we want to guide you to the chat, also to the question submission, and also if you want to hold space, we can also answer anything at the latter part of this webinar. So, transgender, trans identities. Again, we want to couch this in the idea that it's expansive, it's not limiting, and for a basic understanding, a beginning conversation piece, trans or transgendered individuals, um, that is a person whose gender identity and or expression are not aligned with the gender they were assigned at birth. Transgendered is often used as an umbrella term encompassing a large number of identities related to gender nonconformity. Under this, there is a whole other rainbow of words and terminology. For example, there can be transgendered men, trans women, transgendered women, trans non-binary, and all of those, again, going back to our metaphor storytelling, if an individual identifies with a particular gender identity and or expression, that we use our ideas of body sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and compassion when formulating words, sentences, forms, websites, reports, um, radio messages, all of those modes that we do so in a compassionate manner. Let's go ahead and move on to the next term, non-binary. Again, at the end of the resource, it's used to describe people who feel their gender cannot be defined within the margins of a gender binary. Again, that's man, woman, boy, girl, and exists in this space. And Grace will later on explain a little bit more about how Indigenous language in particular held space for individuals who do not fit those conventions of binary gender expressions, gender identities, sexualities. But again, this term instead they understand who people who identify as non-binary, they understand their gender in a way that goes beyond simply identifying as either man or woman. Some non-binary people may feel more comfortable within the trans community and find this as a safe space to be with others who identify as cisgendered, but it isn't always the case. That brings us to our next term, two-spirit. And this, as I've come to understand in being compassionate about the LGBT community, my own understanding and development was that two-spirit is a reclamation of a space. It is an intentional creation. As I understand, it is a terminology that came from, I believe, the 90s. And some folks in the community, Indigenous communities who identify as LGBT two-spirit plus, sometimes it is a contested identity as that it essentializes and erasures the rich linguistic history of Indigenous communities. But again, let's start off with a starting point, a point of departure. Two-spirit is often used today as an umbrella term to describe Indigenous people who identify, again, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, Q, intersect, I, and part of the continuum of non-heterosexual identities. Again, this is specific to folks who self-identify as Indigenous. However, traditionally, people with a two-spirit identity where it's a much more complex topic. Folks, again with an X, were male, female, and sometimes intersex people in Indigenous communities who took on roles and activities in their societies as both men and women, so gendered activities. What's another way to say that? Like cooking, for example. People who are listening on this broadcast and who are listening on the recording, when we think of the gendered role of cooking, what comes up for you? What identity pops up for you? And this, we hope, expands the idea that in traditional and contemporary Indigenous societies, that there is a space that is being held for our wonderful kinfolk. Um, in other words, two-spirit person is and was someone who crossed social gender roles, gender expression, and sexual orientation. It could be all of those things, or it could be one, depending on the Indigenous community in which you're referring to that person. In most communities, they were not considered to be part of that binary system, but they occupied a very distinct alternative gender status. For myself, I've shared this with coworkers in our Diné language, Diné Bazad. I specifically know a term that refers to two-spirit folks in our linguistic culture. There is a lot of tradition and custom when speaking that word out loud, and it's very reverent as that it invokes the status of our most precious female deity. And to utter that word as a Dina, it is a very special privilege to address people in our community with that word. So there's a lot of variation in how to handle even those words. In most communities, they have elevated statuses, again, that Grace can go over and that you can read later on in the publication. But in particular, if you go to the publication, that section is pages 3 to 7 of the resource guide. And now a little bit of levity. On your screen, you'll see a term that is indigiqueer. At the beginning of the recording, we had mentioned that language evolves, that it develops, Indigenous people adapt, it relies on resiliency. And if you take apart the playfulness of the word, it's queer and Indigenous. So there is this wonderful linguistic tone of a distinct political identity and reclamation of a once sharp tool colonizers had used to describe LGBT folks in a pejorative and derogatory use of the word queer. But again, through social movements, through developing it as a community in all types of industries, we hold space for the playfulness and inventiveness of that term indigiqueer. But this is a little introduction that there are beyond terms, resources beyond the recording of this resource here. So next slide.
Thank you for that, Marlon. As you can see, so much of this language has nuances, and a part of that is because language is so limiting. And also, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, like with that language that we've been using within the United States, or what's now known as the United States, we use this language to be able to communicate with each other, but so many tribes have different languages for some of these things as well. And I'll talk about that a little too. And we also see the way that language has evolved. Previously, using the word queer was seen as a slur for people living a few decades ago, but now it's been reclaimed and is used as something that's empowering. And so we see the way that language has gone back and forth and can sometimes be limiting. And Marlon, I think, gave a great example and introduction to that. But so much of the issues and needs for the LGBT plus community, and I am using that just to shorten it a little bit in terms of me not tripping over my words in these acronyms and letters. So I mean, no offense by that. But so much of their needs and their issues go beyond language and terminology. And so I want to be able to adequately discuss that as well, and as well as highlight some resources that help tend to that. But before I do that, I also want to talk about LGBTQ2S plus people in Native communities and the kind of people that we're serving and why we're talking about this today. Next slide, please. That was please as in a thank you, not like a please and hurry, just so you know. But yes, so prior to colonization, people of all sexualities and genders were an important part of tribal communities. Though tribes varied in their ways of living and being, people of all sexualities and gendered were acknowledged and sometimes even had special roles within the tribe. An example of this is today what we call Two-Spirit people. And so I want to give a little bit of a history of Two-Spirit and the way we use it. And I think Marlon gave a great introduction to that, but I just want to go a little bit more into depth. Next slide, please. And the reason why I'm going a little bit more into depth is because it's such a common term that's used in our communities. And I feel like there's some confusion. There's not just confusion, I'll say. I think that there's also just an ongoing debate as well. Because some communities and some individual people don't like the term two-spirit for themselves or for their communities. Some people think of it in this very specific way and don't want it to be used in this more, I guess, modern way, which I'll explain a little bit. And some people disagree with that. And so I just want to make sure that I'm giving the nuance and full kind of history of what this term is and how it can be used today. So Two-Spirit is often used today as an umbrella term to describe Indigenous peoples who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and part of the continuum of non-heterosexual and non-gender conforming identities. However, traditionally, people with their Two-Spirit identity were much more complex. So Two-Spirit people were male, they were female, sometimes intersex people who took on the roles and activities of both men and women. So in other words, a Two-Spirit person was someone who crossed the social gender roles, gender expression, and sexual orientation. In most Indigenous communities, they were not considered to be men or women, but rather they occupied a distinct alternative gender status. So while Two-Spirit is a term that we now use, or many people now use to describe these people in tribes who crossed gender roles, expressions, and sexual orientations, most tribes have their own specific terms or had their own specific terms and through colonization lost it. But many still have those terms within their own languages for gender and sexually diverse members of their communities and the social and spiritual roles they fulfill. So in fact, and more than 2/3 of the over 200 Indigenous language spoken in North America, there were terms used to identify individuals who were neither men nor women. Marlon and I were having a conversation before this in which he brought up a good point that sometimes these words that within different tribes are carry so much spiritual weight and so much nuance around them that sometimes people aren't even allowed, I would say like non-queer people or people with certain identities aren't even allowed to use that language. And I think that is kind of a good point to bring up, that every tribe has their different ways of thinking about non-gender and non-sexual orientation conforming roles and different languages to use them and when they use them. And so that's just something to bring into mind when you are treating or have participants who are LGBT plus in your community. You want to look back and talk to your elders about how we have traditionally dealt with people in our community, but also asking the people who are coming into your court and your program how they want to be treated as well, and kind of keeping in mind those nuances. Next slide, please. So the term Two-Spirit came as a result of colonization and needing a pan-Indian term that communicates this gender variation that exists for many tribes to non-tribal communities. So again, we're seeing the evolution in which language has come about and the ways that we've needed to communicate due to colonization of our people. And Two-Spirit is a good example of that. But even with this term, not all Indigenous communities perceive Two-Spirit people the same way. And some communities do not desire a pan-Indian term to replace the specific terms that they already use within their culture. So kind of like I said before, every tribe is different, which I know we know, but I just want to remind ourselves of that as we are talking about this community as well.
And
Oh, go ahead.
um, not to belabor the point, but maybe as an opportunity to expand Two-Spirit, if we engage the able-bodied use of sight, two, meaning that binary that we had discussed earlier in the terminology section, and that the pan-Indigenous term Two-Spirit wanted to talk about the single-bodied individual that has both masculine and or feminine traits. So that's where two comes from, as we understand now, which is still developing.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Marlon. That was helpful. Yeah, and so though there are differences in the language used to describe gender variations within the tribes, as well as variations in what those roles looked like, it's indisputable that Two-Spirit people had a prominent place in many tribes. Two-Spirit people often had specialized roles, including specialized spiritual roles as healers and ceremonial leaders. They were also teachers, knowledge keepers, herbalists, childminders, interpreters, mediators, and artists. So we see that Two-Spirit people had very special roles and were highly regarded in their communities, not necessarily as like the special thing, but they were just an important part of our community. And that was the case traditionally and historically, and that's still the case today. You can go to the next slide, please. So today, Native people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirit, and all variations of the gender and sexuality are still integral parts of their community. LGBTQ plus people exist in every tribe and are valuable members of their communities, participating in ceremonies, maintaining their cultures, and living in kinship with other relatives and members of the tribes. You likely know some or many queer Indigenous peoples in your communities and in your circles, but feel free to Google other relevant queer Native people working in our communities. There's plenty of prominent ones, both in history, but also today. And we are just here to guide you to those resources, but I encourage you all to look up prominent people within your community and within other tribes. Despite this fact, the loss of Indigenous language, traditional knowledge, and tribes teaching as a result of colonization have had deep and long-lasting impacts for Indigenous LGBT plus people. So because of the loss of language and culture, as well as Western values and ways of living being forced on Indigenous peoples, Native queer people experience harm both on and off reservations, both at the hands of people in and out of their community. This, in addition to other factors particular to this community, has led to ongoing concerns about mental health and well-being of Indigenous queer people, especially because they experience heightened and increasing numbers of suicide. And so that kind of begins to lead into why today we are talking about this topic and why I think it is, or we think it's important for Healing to Wellness courts to prioritize treating LGBT plus Native people and in their communities. Next slide. And to go more into that, I will begin to talk about LGBTQ2S plus participants and Healing Wellness courts. Next slide. So today, Native people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirit, and again, all variations of gender and sexuality are still integral parts of their community. As I've said before, this is repetitive. Let's go to the next slide. My bad. So other factors that lead to Native LGBT plus people being vulnerable is the reality that they experience domestic violence and sexual violence at exceptionally high rates. So the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, reports that Indigenous LGBTQ2S plus communities face systemic discrimination, violence, and harassment at disproportional rates. For example, in 2015 US transgender survey, of all the respondents who experienced sexual assault, 65% were American Indian, Alaskan natives. In addition to mental health and safety concerns, LGBTQ2S plus people are more likely to experience systemic barriers such as poverty and homelessness. So notably, the Trevor Project reports that nearly half, 44% of Native LGBT plus youth have experienced homelessness or housing instability at some point in their life. Despite the prevalence of LGBT plus people in tribal communities and the knowledge that they are particularly vulnerable to experiencing trauma and other harms, there is little research and resources about these communities. In fact, Native people who are also LGBTQ, two-spirit, or identify with a sexual and gender minority group are often invisible in these conversations about data and disparities. The information mentioned previously being pulled, that I talked about, was pulled from extremely limited data. There's really not much available, and the ones that I mentioned were one of the few existing data that is available. UCLA School of Law's Williams Institute noted that despite the fact that the United States has seen a sharp increase in the availability of sexual orientation and gender identity data, at the population level in the last 5 years, Indigenous LGBT plus communities are often invisible in these conversations about data and LGBT disparities. Not only is data on Native LGBT people limited, but so are the resources that are available for this community, leaving a noticeably large gap in accessing care. And so that's kind of how this publication came about. We wanted to make sure that we had the resources that were available accessible to people who are working in healing to wellness courts. Next slide. Limited data and resources also exist for LGBT plus participants in healing and wellness courts and other treatment courts. As it stands now, there is no data that exists on LGBT plus people in any treatment court, let alone healing to wellness courts. So this is concerning because there's a high number of substance use among LGBT plus community. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So data from the 2022 National Survey on Drug Use and Health suggests that substance use patterns reported by lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults differ from those reported by heterosexual adults, finding that approximately 6.7% of these adults in 2020 misuse opioids in the past year compared to the only 3.6% of overall adult population. The NSDUH survey also found out that in 2020, approximately 21.8% of those adults had an alcohol use disorder in the past year, compared to the 11% of the overall population. And other studies have also found these increased rates of alcohol and substance use in transgender communities as well. Next slide, please. So while there is currently no existing data on LGBT plus participants in treatment courts specifically, there is research on these participants who enter other rehabilitation treatments that encourage that this community be tended to in order to better treat their substance use and addictions, as well as to reduce recidivism. So to clarify, it's important that when we're treating LGBT plus participants that we tailor to their needs and to the issues that they're facing to better be able to treat their substance use disorder and addictions. So addiction treatment programs offering specialized groups for gay and bisexual men showed better outcomes for those clients compared to gay and bisexual men in non-specialized programs. Current research is limited on rates of substance use disorder among transgender populations, so we don't have a lot of that to go off of. But research shows that transgender people are more likely to seek treatment than non-transgender populations. So again, it is showing that this is a community that desperately needs to have treatment available to them. Research suggests that substance use disorder treatment should address the unique factors in the LGBT plus people's lives that may include homophobia and transphobia, poverty, housing issues, family problems, violence, and social isolation. However, only 7.4% of rehab programs not only 7.4% offer specialized programs for LGBT plus patients. Next slide, please. So despite the research showing that treatment is tailored to LGBT plus participants, that it is most successful, there is a large gap in inclusive treatment being provided. This creates a barrier in access to treatment for LGBT plus participants, as negative experiences in healthcare settings may preclude some LGBT plus people from seeking out medical treatment for their addictions or mental illnesses or mental health issues. So for example, the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Medical Health surveyed 130 transgender volunteers and found that fear of treatment and past negative experiences accounted for some of the most common barriers to seeking mental health services. The study stated that participants most frequently mentioned that stigma was their main concern, and they were scared of quote unquote mistreatment at the hands of someone who could not understand them. So again, this is really just highlighting how important it is to have treatment that is specific to LGBT plus people and those communities when we are hoping to get them into our programs. And while these barriers exist, the incarceration rate for LGBT plus people are at a higher rate than the rest of population. LGBT plus adults are incarcerated at 3 times the rate of the total adult population, while the population of incarcerated LGBT plus youth is double that of those of the general population. So these disproportional rates are in part due to the factors mentioned previously, such as high rates of homelessness, poverty, discrimination, and violence, in addition to high rates of unemployment. It's for all these reasons that TLPI's resource guide was written with the intention of guiding Healing to Wellness Court staffs to better assisting their LGBT plus participants and community members. It's these community members that are severely underserved community and they're most at risk for harm, which is why it's so important that Healing to Wellness Courts are beginning to address their needs and this community specifically. It's important that LGBT plus people and Native communities not be forgotten in our effort to restore and heal our tribes and our people. This resource guide that has been published and is posted in the chat, it hopes to provide the first steps in better assisting Native LGBT plus people and in better assisting our communities overall, because we know through tribes who ultimately usually many tribes view justice as a circle, and we view the idea that healing one person is healing our entire community. And so that's why I personally think that serving LGBT plus community and participants in particular is important, because when we heal those members of our community, we are healing our entire community, which is strengthening our ability to govern and take care of our entire people, which is strengthening tribal sovereignty. And so with that, we'll go into the resources. We can go to the next.
There's
Okay.
some wonderful discussion being generated in the chat that I think it's really important to highlight at this juncture, Grace.
Yeah.
And a participant had shared the phrase self-identifying, which if we look in our sister social justice intersectionality movements, we are reminded again that it is person first language, that we identify and use the terms that people wish to be identified. And then a little bit more expansion on the two-spirit phrase. Again, reminder that it is a contested word in usage and that we're here to learn. But our participant had reminded us that the term is for Native people to identify as, and not necessarily for non-Native people, as that could be a form of appropriation. And that from the perspective of Indigenous epistemologies, as you had shared, that there are cultural understandings and role to identify as two spirits. And removing that terminology out of that Indigenous context could be harmful, it could be violent, and a little bit insensitive. So we really appreciate that reminder from the chat. And another good resource that was shared is for clinicians or treatment personnel. They are able to attend IHS ECHO webinar sessions if they have any case management questions, etc. And that link is also shared in the chat, indiancountryecho.org. And it specifically is primary care clinicians and behavioral health clinicians who have the invitation to attend. So we really appreciate those resources.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I missed those. When I get on a wall, I get rolling. But thank you, Marlon, for pointing those out and for highlighting those. And thank you for the person in the chat for giving us those resources. Next slide, please. I think that's also a good point, that the resources that are within this resource guide are only what I found in my research, but you all really have the information because you guys are on the ground. You have the best resources that you can give. So obviously reach out to us as a TA provider, but also reach out to each other because, and that's also an Indigenous way of learning, is just learning from one another in the work that we do. So again, thank you so much for putting those resources in the chat, and happy to learn from you all as well. But I will briefly go over the available tools and resources that are within our research guide. So within the research guide, we broke up the LGBT, again, resource guide into 4 sections. So the first section are highlighting the resources concerning LGBT plus participants in treatment courts. The second section is LGBT plus people in state courts. So this section has a judicial bench book and a bench card. Our third section is general resources concerning Native/tribal LGBT plus people. And then our fourth and last section is general resources concerning LGBT plus people. And then in parentheses, it's all these resources that are for not tribal or Native specific people. So just all the resources concerning, and again, obviously there's a million resources, but the ones that we thought were most relevant to LGBT plus people and participants we might see in our programs. So again, I want to highlight that we have at the end of this resource guide a glossary, which touches some of this terminology. And again, maybe imperfect. I kind of gathered it based on the resources we had. But language is changing and we're learning from each other. So just noting that. And then also at the end of the resource guide is a list of relevant organizations listed at the end. And so we broke up that section into resources relevant specifically for Native queer people, and then just a list of relevant organizations nationally for queer people. And that ranges from like legal resources to health and behavioral resources to just communities for people, Native queer people in different regional areas. We even just have some orgs that are like basically just a Facebook group, but we wanted to make sure that we had resources that were connecting people to each other in a way that would be helpful. Next slide. So the first section, resources concerning LGBT plus participants in treatment courts, we have listed, again, I just want to note that there's very few resources for these people in treatment courts, but we have listed what we could find. And that is 2 PowerPoint presentations on the topic, and that might be helpful to you all. Some of them are pretty basic, but it kind of gives you a foundation to work from. And so the 2 PowerPoints that we have listed, one is from the New York Association of Treatment Court Professionals. It's called Culturally Responsiveness with LGBTQ plus people in treatment courts. This PowerPoint goes over key concepts and definitions, stigmas and stereotypes, microaggressions, social detriments to health, unconscious and conscious bias, cultural responsiveness for intake and assessment and treatment with LGBTQ plus drug court participants. So that's kind of what that PowerPoint will go to. You can find that link again in our resource guide. And then the next PowerPoint is from All Rise, which we know as previously was the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. We are changing it to All Rise. We are getting on the program like they want us to. Anyways, so that PowerPoint, the content of that is meant to help identify where disparities occur in these individuals in court and treatment, defines sexual orientation and other key glossary terms, and also identifies several treatment needs of this group of participants, recognizes specific barriers to meeting the needs of these participants, and determines specific strategies to overcoming the barriers of these participants. It also, in this section, we have listed a forthcoming curriculum from All Rise, which I know isn't particularly helpful because it doesn't yet exist, but it will exist very soon. So we wanted to make sure that while we were publishing it, it was in there. And we have a link to all of their publications. This curriculum is going to provide tools and resources for state treatment courts who treat LGBT plus participants. And so that will be really helpful once it's published. It should be published within the next few coming months. Next slide, please. Our next section of resources, we have LGBT plus. It is getting near the end of the webinar. If I butcher that in the future, I am so sorry. I can feel myself getting there. It's about LGBT plus people in state courts. And this is our section that has our judicial bench books and bench cards. It's plural. There's only one of each, but do with that what you will. In this section, we have the 2 available bench books and bench cards that are available to assist judges who have LGBT plus participants in their state courts. While these resources, one is catered to Washington and one is catered to California. The information in them is useful for all courts. You just kind of shift through what you need if you're not in either of those states. So, and again, it's also, again, not tailored necessarily to a treatment court, but just courts in general, and judge etiquette when it comes to LGBT community and participants. So the first one is the bench book, which is Washington State Supreme Court's Gender and Justice Commission is the one who created that. It's a comprehensive bench book designed to serve as an introduction for jurists and legal practitioners to some of the issues affecting LGBT people. This guide touches on the following issues: using inclusive language, court rules and professional responsibility, LGBT plus youth, family law, employment law, public accommodations, legal issues facing transgender people, and LGBTQ plus elders. So though the guide is not, again, for the state of Washington, it can be helpful for other jurisdictions. And then we have our bench card, which was created by the Judicial Council of California. So it's a brief bench card describing useful tips on addressing LGBT plus youth in court, in addition to listing relevant California state laws. If you're within California and have some of those questions, there might be LGBT people facing some of other issues with California state law. And then the tips listed can be applicable to all courts as well. Next slide. Our next section is general resources concerning Native or tribal LGBT plus people. This section is a little bit bigger. I have a few listed here that I thought I liked the most personally. So you got those on the form. But like the preceding section, this section describes general issues for LGBT plus people. And they're, specific to Native and tribal people. These resources touch on health issues, and as well as other issues, tribal resolutions and codes, and creating safe spaces for Indigenous people. So one that I mentioned here is the Tribal Equity Toolkit, the second version. I think it's really, it's one of my favorite resources that we have. It's a little bit tailored to tribal governments, but that is, it does include some information that would be useful to tribal healing and wellness courts, such as legal information for Native LGBT plus people and justice system, child welfare systems, and so forth, specifically tribal systems. And so I think that's really cool. Another cool toolkit I have listed there is celebrating our magic resources for American Indian / Alaska Native transgender and two-spirit youth. So that'll be very specific tailored to that community that might come in healing to wellness court programs. We have a report as well for a national action plan. That one is specifically tailored to missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as LGBT plus people. And that's very relevant for this week, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Peoples Action Week. Marlon's red necklace really represents that. And this issue is also relevant to that. And so that is great. That one's written specifically for the government of Canada. A lot of cool stuff always comes from Canada. I get really jealous, but is relevant also to Indigenous and tribal nations here in the US as well. And there's also other things. We have educational guides, we have info sheets, we have other resource sheets that people have created before us, and websites as well. And that can all be found in that section within our resource guide. Next slide, please. All right, next slide is just general resources concerning LGBT plus people in general. So it's not necessarily tribal or Native specific. So these resources touch on topics such as appropriate language and terminology. There's a lot of resources for that specifically, I think, because it's very confusing and nuanced. So you'll see that kind of within each section. It also has how to make courts more inclusive to people of different genders and sexualities, and tips for judges when interacting with LGBT plus clients and other relevant considerations. So some of the things I have listed is another toolkit, gender inclusivity in the courts, how to treat everyone with fairness, dignity, and impartiality. We have other resource kits, we have PowerPoints, info sheets, articles, websites, education materials. All of those are also listed in these sections, but we're nearing the end and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And Marlon will go ahead and facilitate this section. And if we could turn the recording off just so that we have some privacy for people who might want to ask questions. They don't necessarily want the whole world to see in a recording later. That'd be great. So thank you all for joining us. We will have an evaluation link right after this if you want to stay on for one more second. But before that, again, our overall email for Wellness Court TA is wellness@tlpi.org. I put that in the chat. But also our personal email addresses if you want to talk to us one-on-one about this or ask any other questions. Mine is grace@tlpi.org and Marlon's is marlon@tlpi.org. And I can put that in the chat too. Next slide. And that is the evaluation link. We would really love it if you took some time to fill out that evaluation, and also make sure that you sign up for CLE, the JOT form, which I believe is the same sheet. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, Chelsea. Yeah, so make sure you sign up for that too if you're interested in receiving CLEs. And I think that's it. So thank you so much for joining. And I hope you all have a great day. Oh, I didn't know, sorry, if Angie or Chris, maybe I should have, if Angie or Chris have anything to say.
Nope. Once again, thank you for joining us. And don't forget the other sessions that we have in this series. And as we celebrate National Drug Court Month, letting you know that Healing to Wellness courts are under the umbrella of problem solving and treatment courts. So we should definitely celebrate our Healing to Wellness courts. Angie?
Yep, that's the only thing I was just going to say, what you just said, Chris, is thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, Serving LGBTQ2S plus participants in tribal healing to wellness courts, and look forward to seeing you every Thursday this month for our other webinars. Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.